Welcome back to the Linux 30-Day Challenge, and if you watched part 1, you already know the running joke of this whole series, which is that I seem to be personally cursed when it comes to making this switch. I am the person for whom everything that can go sideways does, and I have good news and bad news to report since last time. The bad news, and I might as well say it right at the top, is that the curse is not over. It is still very much following me around everywhere I go, still finding creative new ways to turn a simple 5-minute task into a 2-hour detour through forum threads and terminal commands. But the good news, and this is genuinely why I wanted to keep going rather than quit, is that it is getting better. Noticeably better. The frequency of the disasters is dropping noticeably, the severity of each one is dropping too, and most importantly of all, my own ability to actually dig myself out of them is climbing remarkably fast. For anyone just joining, here's the premise. I committed to using Linux Mint as my daily driver for 30 straight days. No sneaking back to Windows the moment things get hard. No comfortable dual boot escape hatch waiting for me. Just me and the Penguin, figuring it all out in real time and documenting every single triumph and every spectacular faceplant along the way. Part 1 was, to put it as generously as I possibly can, a deeply humbling experience from start to finish. This is part 2, the part where I finally tell you whether the early chaos was a clear sign I'd made a terrible mistake, or just the normal turbulence of learning, something genuinely new. Spoiler, it is looking more and more like the second one, and the data backs that up in a way that surprised even me. Let me quickly recap the curse for anyone who missed part 1, because the context matters for understanding why this update feels like such a turning point. My first week was defined by a graphics driver nightmare. Out of the box, my system booted to a screen that flickered and tore. My external monitor refused to run at its proper refresh rate, and every fix I found online seemed to contradict the last one. On top of that, my Wi-Fi adapter simply did not want to cooperate, dropping connection at random, and forcing me into the terminal to coax it back to life more times than I'd like to admit. If you are a long-time Linux user watching this, you are probably nodding, because these are almost rites of passage. But coming from an operating system where this hardware just worked without a thought, it felt like the universe was specifically conspiring against me. I genuinely wondered, around day 6, whether I had the patience to see this through. The thing nobody tells you about switching is that the difficulty is front-loaded. The hardest part is not learning Linux. The genuinely hardest part is that first brutal stretch, where you simply do not yet know enough to fix your own problems, and every single error message looks like an impenetrable wall standing between you and getting anything done. What I want to show you in this part is what happens on the other side of that wall, because the experience after the initial hump is a completely different thing, and it tracks with something much bigger happening across the whole Linux world right now. Here's the context that reframed my entire struggle, and it is worth sharing because it took the experience from feeling like a personal failure to feeling like part of a genuine movement. I'm not switching alone, and the timing of this challenge turns out to be significant. Linux desktop market share grew from 2.76% in July 2022 to roughly 4.7% globally by 2025, which is growth of over 70% in just 3 years. In the United States, Linux crossed the 5% desktop threshold for the first time in June 2025. Now, I want to be precise here because the numbers vary depending on who is measuring and where. Some trackers put the global figure lower, with stat counters reading in April 2026, placing Linux at around 2.99% worldwide against Windows at roughly 63.66%. So this is not a story of Linux suddenly taking over. It absolutely and definitely is not that at all. But the trajectory is unmistakable, and analysts have pointed to 2026 as a potential breakthrough year. The forces driving it are exactly the things pushing people like me to try. The end of Windows 10 support has left a huge number of older but perfectly good machines facing a choice between an expensive upgrade or a switch. Privacy concerns are mounting, and the cost savings are real. So while I sat there in week 1 cursing my flickering screen and questioning all of my life choices, I was actually part of a much larger wave of people making the exact same deliberate decision at the same moment in time, all running headfirst into the same walls, and crucially, all building the same collective momentum that makes those very walls lower and easier for the next person who tries. Now to the actual progress, because that is what this part is really about, and the single biggest improvement has been in gaming, which honestly shocked me. Going in, my biggest fear was that switching to Linux meant giving up my game library. That particular fear turns out to be largely outdated now, and the actual data on it is genuinely striking. Linux gaming hit 5.33% on Steam in March 2026, which was the first time it ever crossed the 5% mark on the platform. That surge is being driven by 3 things working together: the Steam Deck normalizing Linux gaming for a massive audience, the maturing of Proton, which is the compatibility layer that lets Windows games run on Linux, and again, the end of Windows 10 support nudging people to look elsewhere. In my own experience, this is where the curse loosened its grip the most. Games that I assumed would never run launched on the first try through Proton. My library, which I expected to lose, came over almost entirely intact, with only a couple of stubborn holdouts. There was a genuine and almost comical moment of pure disbelief the first time. A game I had completely written off booted right up and ran perfectly smoothly. Because it so directly contradicted the story I had been told for years about Linux gaming being a hopeless lost cause. It is not a lost cause anymore. It is, in a great many cases now, simply and unremarkably just gaming. That single realization did more to convince me this challenge was survivable than anything else, because gaming was the thing I was most afraid of losing. And it turned out to be one of the areas where Linux has improved the most dramatically. That said, I promised honesty, and the curse is genuinely not over, so let me talk about where it still bites, because pretending everything is perfect would do you a disservice. The single most persistent frustration, and this is echoed across the entire community, is software compatibility for specific professional applications. The big one that comes up again and again is Adobe. As one user put it bluntly, unless Adobe supports Linux, this will not change. And that remains a real wall for anyone whose work or hobby depends on Photoshop, Premiere, or the rest of that suite. The same goes for music production. Creators with large collections of commercial VST plugins, the instruments and effects that producers build their entire workflow around, face a genuine compatibility hurdle, and I have felt this myself with a couple of applications I rely on that simply have no native Linux version. There are workarounds, there are excellent open source alternatives, there are compatibility layers. But I am genuinely not going to sit here and pretend to you that a workaround is always as good as the real thing, because the honest truth is that sometimes it simply is not. And you absolutely deserve to know that clearly before you make the leap yourself. The other lingering curse is smaller but real, which is that the answer to a new user's very first question, which distro should I even pick, is genuinely overwhelming. The sheer overwhelming number of available choices, each one with its own passionate and vocal advocates online, can completely paralyze a total beginner before they have even managed to install a single thing. I got lucky with my pick. But I completely understand why that initial decision stops people cold. What has changed most, though, is not really the operating system. It is me, and I think that is the most important lesson of this entire challenge so far. In part 1, every problem was a crisis because I had no framework for solving it. An error message was a dead end. By part 2, that same kind of problem has been demoted to a mere inconvenience, because over these weeks I have slowly and steadily built up the one single skill that actually matters most on Linux, which is simply knowing how to find the answer when something goes wrong. I have learned how the file system is laid out. I have stopped being afraid of the terminal and started to genuinely appreciate how powerful it is when you know a few commands. I have figured out which community forums and resources actually help and which send you in circles. This is the part of the learning curve that nobody can shortcut for you, and it is also the part that pays off the most. And it lines up with what people who have spent real time with modern distros are reporting. The sentiment increasingly is that Linux no longer feels like a niche operating system that you have to fight your way through, and that, in a number of ways, it has actually become more forward-thinking than Windows itself. I would not have believed that statement during my flickering screen week. I am starting to believe it now. The modern desktop environments are genuinely polished and pleasant to look at. Many everyday tasks are genuinely more pleasant than their Windows equivalents. The curse in those early days made me think that Linux itself was actively hostile toward me. Getting past that initial curse slowly showed me that it was really just unfamiliar all along, which is a completely different and a far, far more solvable problem to have. So where does that leave the challenge? And what should you take from this if you are sitting on the fence about trying it yourself? Here is my honest assessment at this midpoint. The difficulty of switching to Linux is real, but it is almost entirely concentrated at the very beginning. And it is the kind of difficulty that disappears as your knowledge grows, rather than the kind that grinds you down forever. The curse, in other words, genuinely does have a limited shelf life on it. The momentum behind Linux right now is also real and worth factoring in, because it means the friction keeps decreasing. Every single month that passes, more hardware works perfectly out of the box, more games run flawlessly through Proton, and more detailed guides exist online for the exact problem you are about to run into next. Analysts suggest Linux could reach around 6% global desktop share by late 2026 if current trends hold, driven by the Windows 10 end of life, improved gaming compatibility, and privacy concerns. And you can feel that growing support as a practical thing when you're troubleshooting, because the answer is almost always out there now. but I am also not going to oversell it. If your livelihood depends on Adobe's suite or specific Windows-only professional software with no viable alternative, the curse may genuinely be a deal breaker for you right now, and that is a legitimate reason to wait or to dual boot rather than commit fully. Genuine honesty about the real limitations is the only way this entire series is actually worth anything to you at all. Linux is not magic, and to be completely fair, it is not quite for absolutely everyone just yet, but it is far closer to ready for ordinary people than its reputation suggests. As we head into the back half of this 30-day challenge, here is what I'm committing to test and report back on, so you know exactly what is coming. I want to push the professional software question hard to find out whether the alternatives and compatibility layers are genuinely good enough for real work, or whether that wall is as solid as the community says. I want to put the gaming improvements through a proper stress test with a wider range of titles, now that the early results have been so encouraging. And I want to see whether the daily friction continues to drop, or whether there is a second wave of the curse waiting for me that I have not discovered yet, because if there is, you will absolutely hear about it, unfiltered. The whole entire point of doing this challenge in public, including all of the genuinely embarrassing parts that I could easily edit out, is that the hype around Linux in 2026 is extremely loud right now. And you honestly deserve to see what the real, unvarnished experience is actually like for a completely normal person, rather than for a lifelong expert, curse and all. So here is where I land at the halfway mark. The curse is not over. I fully expect it to strike again before day 30. But the trend is unmistakable, and it is pointing in the right direction. Things that were disasters in week 1 are now minor speed bumps. The thing I was most afraid of losing, my games, I largely kept. And the skills I have picked up mean that the next problem, whatever it is something I can probably solve myself. That right there is what getting better actually looks like in practice. It is genuinely not the complete absence of problems. It is instead the steadily growing ability to handle whatever problems do come your way. If you have ever thought about trying Linux yourself, especially with Windows 10 now behind us, I genuinely think there has never been a better moment, curse and all. Hit subscribe to follow along with the rest of the challenge. Drop your own Linux horror stories and hard-won victories down in the comments, because I genuinely do read them and they really help, and I will see you all in part 3.